were times when I spent months promoting a concert that ultimately like 30 people showed up to. And we lost money and months of time and effort went into it. And, not a great night, wasting your time at a show that only 30 people wanted to show up to. But I then compare that to podcasts, and some people are like, man, my podcast is only getting 30 listens a week.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, you're telling me that people that you didn't have to go out, you didn't have to go rent a venue and a club or set up a whole live event, and you still have people returning every single week, 30 of them? That's a great success where you didn't have to put a ton into it. And if you can get that up to 50 or 100, you're outpacing so many people that try to do live events, whether it's an entrepreneur event or meetup or a concert or whatever it might be. You're having more attendance each week.
The following is my conversation with Spencer Carpenter. Spencer is the founder of Outlier Audio, a full-service podcast booking agency that represents talented entrepreneurs, business professionals, and investors specializing in real estate investors. Prior to working in the podcasting space, Spencer spent over a decade working in the music industry, taking on various roles including talent management and representation, event and festival organizing, record label head, and more. Spencer's pivot to the podcasting space came when the music industry shut down due to COVID-19, and he saw a need to help entrepreneurs, investors, and business professionals get on the new medium as a way to continue growing their business. In this episode, we covered the most difficult parts about working in the music industry, why the pivot to a podcast booking agency, and the hardest part about being an entrepreneur. Enjoy the episode. Spencer, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Really excited to have you, and I've really been looking forward to this conversation for a while because I think you're the first guest I'm having where I'm actually talking to a guest about podcasting on a podcast. So that should be some fun there. And, a lot of really interesting things I want to ask you about, some of the stuff that you're up to and what you're doing, but I think I have a really fun place to start. So,
all right, let's do it.
High level, you're the founder of Outlier Audio, and you represent a lot of awesome individuals. But before all that, you actually worked in the music industry. So take me back a bit, and how'd you get started there?
Yeah, so I grew up in a little farm town in southern Pennsylvania, and my cousin started a band, but I wasn't good enough to be in it, so I started booking concerts, just shows locally because there's nothing else to do here. And I then scaled up to doing multi-day music conferences and festivals out in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and I ran a couple of small record labels. But and then I was running a club in Atlantic City before COVID shut everything down. But pretty much all along the way, I was always dealing in both sides of talent representation. And when I found podcasts, I found it through listening to investing podcasts. And so I would hear these people, I thought they were just giving away the keys to the kingdom, talking about building real estate portfolios and investing in this, that, and the other. And I just thought these were all like celebrities. I thought they were like all on the level of Richard Branson or Mark Cuban or something. And then when I'd go and look them up on social media, I found that they have 500 Instagram followers. It was really just, for lack of a better term, they were Joe Schmo investor. And that podcasting was a space where the everyday person, entrepreneur or business professional that might be very talented at what they do, but not known at a celebrity level, could still get out to the world. And I just recognized that it was unlikely that anybody was really offering them talent-related services. And so that's what I shifted to when COVID shut everything down, is I started this podcast booking agency to help talented business professionals and investors and entrepreneurs get out there.
Got it. On a quick note, you said you were listening to a lot of investor podcasts. Is there one that you remember vividly or kind of one that appealed the most to you?
Oh yeah, I exclusively listened to Bigger Pockets for like 4 years. That was all I was doing podcast wise, but I was doing it multiple hours a day.
Who's the host of Bigger Pockets?
Right now it is David Green and Rob Apostolo. At the time it was Josh Dorkin and Brandon Turner.
Okay, awesome, interesting. Brandon Turner's the one baseball guy, right? If I'm not mistaken, or is that someone else?
Ryan Pineda.
Same
sphere though.
Got it. Okay, close enough. I appreciate you filling that gap for me, and really appreciate you talking about some of the kind of music talent, and also what you saw when you wanted to start Outlier Audio. But just to dive in a little more in depth, you said you kind of started in the music industry in southeastern Pennsylvania, and I also happen to be from Pennsylvania, so this is a bit of a selfish question from my end. But is there a lot of music talent in the area? I mean, a lot of people
Oh
think
yeah.
about music and Hollywood talent. They think about California, Hollywood, the big cities. So was there a lot of stuff going on in PA?
Yeah, I mean, Philadelphia is still a major market for any artist to come play.
Hmm.
And there's, varying levels of success in different, different genres. But out where I was at in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, actually, there's a Grammy nominated metal band called August Burns Red that,
Interesting.
you know, people have no idea that, like, a lot of people in the country don't know that Lancaster has a city. They just think it's Amish country. So then to hear there's a metal band from there is really confusing to them. But then the '90s rock band Alive came from York, Pennsylvania, which they considered it Lancaster.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, so those were just things that kind of were in our wheelhouse. And then P&B Rock, he was out of Philadelphia and he was blowing up for a while. And so yeah, there's been a lot going on, but because Pennsylvania is so close to New Jersey and Maryland and southern New York,
Hmm.
um, the scenes can all be different, but in general, the whole area, there's lots of potential all the time and lots of stuff going on.
Tri-state area, really interesting on there. Appreciate you sharing that. Just to dive deeper still kind of regarding the music industry, so you worked in that for a while before Outlier Audio, and we'll get into some kind of podcast specific questions there. But during your time working in the music industry, what were the hardest parts?
Um, well, definitely like ego, people not
Hmm.
really getting along, and or just everyone, whether it's malicious or not, everyone has their own job to do, and they have their own clients to look out for. And even if somebody wants to do you a favor, if it's not in the best interest of their client, they're rarely going to do it.
Hmm.
And I think the part of the reason I liked shifting over to the podcasting space and dealing with entrepreneurs is there's much more community and willingness to help each other. And it's not as big of a lift to share resources with somebody else or share an opportunity with someone else because there's so much. Whereas in the music industry space, there's only so many opportunities and you can't really just pass them off to somebody else or
Hmm.
really worry about someone else's trajectory. Whereas in entrepreneurship and business, like rising tides can raise all boats if you have a good system set up and you have good partnerships and things like that.
So, would you say the biggest stark difference there is that in something like Hollywood or when there's a lot of talent because there's competing roles, egos sometimes are overinflated as opposed to entrepreneurship where there's more of an emphasis on collaboration and kind of creating something as opposed to, the competitive landscape?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. And I'd say in any industry you have to deal with ego, you have to deal with people's perceptions of themselves, and how you decide to handle those is completely on you.
Hmm.
um I but when you're when you're dealing with artists, they all think that they have the potential to be a generational name,
Hmm.
or leave a legacy. Whereas, at least if someone is good in business, they understand that they're operating a payroll company and it's never going to be someone's household name.
Hmm.
They're just a payroll company, but they're really good at what they do. And that is where I saw the opportunity in the podcasting space is, they might only operate a payroll company, but they scaled a business from 5 employees to 100, and that still
Hmm.
took talent and took expertise. And there are other people that can learn from that. And that was part of what I saw in a comparison of the two, and why I decided I'd rather work in the podcasting space and return to music.
Got it. It's a really interesting note on there and can definitely validate that personally from, hosting a bunch of entrepreneurs myself. Quick final note here, just on stuff you did in the music industry. So I totally get that you made the pivot into the entrepreneurship space, and I'll get into a bit of that a little later. But reflecting on your time working in kind of, I don't want to say media, working in music, what were the most valuable lessons you would say you learned there?
Well, because no one company at the time was paying me enough in itself to just focus on that job, I
Mhm.
had to work multiple jobs and learn multiple things. And that, I mean, at one point I was running 5 individual businesses under one umbrella company, but that meant I was learning the skill sets for all of them. And then being able to take those skill sets and realize it wasn't just in the music space that I could implement them was huge in me seeing the ability to pivot to whatever I wanted to with those skill sets. And that's something I really like people to understand, especially if they're not happy with where they're at in their job, is like, don't associate your skill set with your job. It's what is the skill set overall. And me running concerts and festivals and stuff like that, I wasn't, while my title at the time was concert promoter or festival organizer, I was really a logistics expert. And I could apply that in many other areas if I wanted. I did other types of live events when I left music, but prior to COVID, to do other things. But I could have easily applied those logistics expertise to a trucking company if I wanted. I would have to go and learn some of the nuance of trucking logistics, but I know I could do it if I needed to do it. And I think that was really powerful for me and feeling confident that I could go and do other things.
So, quick follow on to one of the things that you just said. You said kind of when you're working in the talent representation field, oftentimes, the comp isn't as favorable. Just out of curiosity, what is the comp structure like in talent representation? Is it just like a percentage of the deals that you get, or is there some kind of flatline fee? What does that look like?
More often than not, it is just percentage. Usually if there's a flat fee, it's with someone that's not providing their value, and they know that, so they'd rather get a flat fee. But I'm sure there's all types of backdoor deals happening all the time. I was never at the level where I was dealing with major labels. I was dealing with small metal bands and some hip hop artists and stuff like that. And but even between those two worlds, the way things worked were different. How promoters and artists worked and all that stuff, compensation, it was all very different industry, genre to genre.
Got it. Interesting note in there. Appreciate you sharing that. So to switch gears a bit and to get to kind of your main focus now, which is Outlier Audio, and I appreciate you sharing earlier about how one, you found that the pandemic was a good time to switch because there was kind of this downturn in the music industry, and there were downturn live events, and also it sounded like internally you wanted to make a shift. So that being said, I'm sure it still wasn't easy, especially at a time when kind of the business environment was really uncertain. So when you started Outlier Audio, what was the hardest part about starting the company?
Well, I didn't have any. I was pretty confident that the concept of the business was going to work. It was really getting to a point where I had the credibility. And so, to get someone on a big show, I also needed to have someone with a big name. And so kind of figuring out how I was going to make that all work was something that took a little bit of time. But also, like, I had never really done anything where I had to go generate sales. I have a photo booth rental business, but I just set up Google ads and like that kind of did all the work for me. I knew that wasn't going to really be the same here, and I needed to go find talented entrepreneurs. And I was lucky enough that I got connected with a marketing agency that could use my service to upsell. And so my first clients were through them, which allowed me to learn a little bit more, not prove the concept because I already knew it would work, but get a little bit of an understanding of what the landscape was. And then that allowed me to know what I could go and promise people moving forward as I stepped into, bigger talent, what I could explain to them what to expect, or have a better understanding of, like, I've been dealt with people at a lower level before. I know you're at a higher level, so I'm very confident I can deliver more for you than I was for other people. And so that was, but it took time. It took a lot of time to get to that point.
Got it. Fair enough. And I think one of the most important aspects of it too is you were willing to kind of, instead of strictly on your own thing, yes, you were doing your own thing, but you were kind of working with a partner to kind of help them sell their service. But at the same time, you're learning a lot of things that will help you kind of as you're trying to focus on your own thing. So I also think that's, a really underrated fact. One thing I wanted to touch upon really quickly that you just mentioned was when you got started into this, you didn't have, the credibility as like a built agent or kind of a really reputable podcast agent. So how did you go about building that credibility?
Well, it really was. I'm my biggest critic when it comes to the shows I get my clients on. Like, going back to music, if you got your artist to headline Coachella, that's like one of the biggest accomplishments you could have, or Madison Square Garden or something. I was never in a position where I was going to have that happen.
You might be one day with one of your entrepreneurs, so never sell your
Well, but I looked at podcasts. I'm like, any podcast is just like an email away. Like, I just have to be able to present to them someone good. And so I haven't had anybody on Rogan or something like that, but it's totally possible. I'm much more closer to that than I ever was having an artist on Coachella. And so being able to build up that credibility was really me going and finding people that I thought weren't being represented the way they needed to be, or just, I mean, there's not a lot of people that do what I do. So oftentimes if I just reached out to somebody and let them know what I do, they were intrigued, even whether or not they signed up to work with me. They didn't hear about anybody doing it, so they wanted to find out more. And that made it easier for me to get my foot in the door with people that I knew were actively podcasting, but probably doing the outreach themselves. And so if I could take that off their plate, they were willing to work with someone that could. And then just being able to differentiate myself between an assistant or a VA, you know, by saying like, I do this full time, like you can ask your assistant to do this, you can ask your VA to do it, but they're not going to specialize in it. And they might not really have the experience to understand what is a worthwhile podcast for your time and what is just them filling the requests that you asked. Whereas I can do that, and I can go to conferences and I can network with people. And if that's my only job, I'm going to be better at it than someone else that does it just part-time. So being able to kind of make that case helped as well.
For sure. And I think always when you specialize, you know, it's one thing if one talent institution or kind of one talent agent offers a bunch of these services, but if one of those services you do really, really well, that incentivizes, you know, an entrepreneur or a client to go with you that much better. Quick follow-on to one of the things that you just said. You know, you mentioned talent representation and how a lot of times, you know, a VA or generalist could be just trying to fill a slot. You know, from someone that specializes, what advice would you give to someone who's, you know, also trying to maybe not just work in the podcast space, but is trying to get into the talent representation space? Like, what's the biggest mistake someone could make there?
I just think it requires a lot of self-awareness. You know, it's important for you. You want to be able to represent your talent as a talented individual, but you also need to understand where they're really at. So if you submit someone to a show and that show, you know, that's kind of above their pay grade and they get denied from it, you can't take it personally. And you can't then let that ruin a relationship. You can't let ego get in the way. And then sometimes you also need to, but you can also evaluate, you know, I think this person should only be focused on top 200 podcasts because that's where their time is well spent. And that's their body of work allows for that to be an option. You know, every client I work with is at a different level in their career and their notoriety. And so I have to evaluate that each time. And so I think one mistake could really be letting ego get in the way of rejection, especially when you're first coming into it. You know, it took a long time for me to have any clients on top 200 podcasts. It didn't mean I wasn't having conversations with those people in advance, but I always kept it very cordial and polite. And I just appreciate the fact that they got back to me at all, because I know some of these people get hundreds of emails a week. And so even if it was a canned response from an assistant, like the fact that just they didn't ignore it was appreciated by me. And so being able to just work through that until I had something that made sense for the show. And that's the other thing, is just understanding not everyone is a perfect fit for every show. And you might think you're great for a show, but you're not. You have no idea how many people have come to me and not even really said, like, can you get me on Rogan? But have been like, oh, I'd love to be on Rogan. I'm like, do you listen to him? Because he doesn't talk about business, and that's what you do. So why would you even think that was ever an option for you? You know, it's just like having, you know, managing expectations and just making sure people understand, you know, the value of a podcast, even if it's not the size of Rogan's. Like, there's a lot of benefits from being on any show, and really helping people understand that is core to what we do.
You know, I think to emphasize one of the things that you just said, I think a lot of times, you know, obviously everybody wants to grow their audience, everyone wants to have a bigger platform, but I think a lot of the times people view things more in the way of emotionally clout as opposed to purpose. And I think you see a lot of these huge, amazing podcasts, and there's amazing podcasts for every niche out there. I mean, business, entrepreneurship, marketing. You know, Rogan is more of kind of a lifestyle, shoot the shit kind of guy, and there's a few other ones that are relatively similar. But I think that the hardest part for a lot of people sometimes is, and I'm not perfect with this either. And I think a lot of times people, think they're maybe further in the journey than they are, and they try to kind of shoot for the stars. And nothing is wrong with trying to get on that journey. But I think what people fail to realize, and what would be a great grounding, is that, the way you get there is brick by brick. You don't just kind of get on a rocket and kind of shoot up there. So I just really wanted to emphasize that point. But I also wanted to ask a quick follow on. So since you're working with a lot of people, and you have a lot of this music industry experience as sort of kind of an agent of these individuals, would you say a lot of time your job is really kind of managing emotions or emotional expectations of both sides?
Uh, no, and I mean, I sometimes have to address that in the beginning. But
Hmm.
the great thing about dealing in this space again versus music is like in music you're dealing with artists that all are wondering why they're not,
Winning a
the biggest
Grammy or
artists in
like,
the world. They all think they're great.
hmm
Whereas entrepreneurs are a little more, back to understanding like where you're at. They understand personal development. Some of them have an ego, some are very humble. And I mean, I talk to them like they're adults.
hmm
If I've said to someone in an onboarding interview, they gave me a lowdown of their business. I said, okay, what do you do that's special then? And because they didn't tell me that, they didn't give
hmm
me any reason to believe they did anything special. And I'm not going to go out and pitch somebody uh, with their false expectation that what they're doing is nuanced and special if they haven't told me how it is.
hmm
I kind of have to work to get to that. These
hmm
are like oftentimes entrepreneurs are people that have worked on their mindset. They've dealt with rejection, they've dealt with
hmm
success, and I can deliver news to them and assume that they're going to accept it as a mature person. And if in our text thread we also talk a little bit shit about the situation, we can. But like
hmm
nobody's feelings are getting hurt. It's I'm dealing with adults, so it's definitely very different than having to deal with the emotions of an unstable artist.
Yeah, for sure. And the expectations are probably a little more on par since they do have a little bit more practical experience. And, I just want to emphasize nothing is wrong with being an artist if that's what you want to do, but you have to maybe be an artist and think of the process like an entrepreneur, knowing that it's going to be step by step to, when you're really on that grand scale, you're not just going to perform at, the Grammys or Coachella or Ultra in one year. So can
Well, ultimately, the successful artists are still running a business, and
that as well.
some of the successful artists are very hands on in that business, but nobody knows it. And then others aren't. They know to hire someone else, but they still learn the ins and
Mhm,
outs and try to make decisions based on understanding. Like it's not just about the music anymore. Like I run a multi-million-dollar business, and
mhm.
it has to be looked at that way.
For sure. And I appreciate you emphasizing that point. On a similar note, as you mentioned, since you work with a lot of entrepreneurs and you help them get on shows that are kind of a great fit for them to speak and also for, the show themselves, for the kind of guests that they're looking for. Before an entrepreneur gets on a podcast, what advice do you give these entrepreneurs before they get on so they can really kind of, be a great podcast guest?
I mean, I always recommend that they go at least listen to the show first. Know
A
who the
great
host is,
suggestion.
and yeah, I mean, it's look. There are definitely some people where it's not always necessary. I mean, if you're gonna be asking me questions, I just have to show up and be myself. That's the
Mhm,
number one piece of advice. Understand you're showing up to be yourself and answer questions about what you do and who you are. There's no one better to fill your shoes than you.
mhm,
But beyond that, if you want to be more prepared, it's going to the podcast beforehand, listening to at least one episode, if not a few. And maybe that can, you can reference that in the conversation later on. And I mean, then other things are just like making sure you're not like tapping in the background and letting the
mhm.
mic pick that up. I don't know if you could hear that or not, but
A little bit, but it was a
little
good
things.
example of one of what someone shouldn't do. But I appreciate you bringing it up.
Yeah, I mean, some people don't understand. If you have ice in a glass and you
Mhm,
take a drink of it, it's going to clink around. If you have a
mhm,
fan and there's a chain hanging down from it, it might be moving around and it might be very normal for you, but the listener is going to hear it. And so just trying to do everything you can to make sure that the quality of the conversation is what you want the person on the other end to hear. Um, I mean, those are very basic things, but if you've never done it before, you
mhm.
might not know. But at the same time, once you learn, it's not that difficult.
Yep, it's the small stuff. And to give you a little bit from kind of the podcaster's perspective. So I know right now people, if they're watching this video, they just see me, but I have like a mic down here. I have my mic plugged in. I have my computer plugged in so it doesn't power off. I have a light looking at me. I have to make sure my camera's good. I mean, over time, this stuff kind of becomes like second nature, but maybe the same thing goes for podcast guests. And there's, the little things that you want to make sure you take care of. So really
Yeah,
appreciate
I've got a ring light here because otherwise I'd have shadows on my face.
Mhm.
Like it's it's those little things that make it all worth it.
For sure. Exclusive behind the scenes here, we're talking about, but really appreciate the discussion on there. To switch gears a little bit about here, thinking from the podcaster's perspective, what's the number one piece of advice you have for podcasters looking to build a successful podcast?
That's a hard one.
Welcome to the
I mean, I
podcast.
definitely like I do have part of our business does help edit and distribute podcasts, but I definitely don't consider myself a podcast growth expert or
Mhm.
strategist. The one thing I can say for sure is that if you stop doing it after episode 8, you're definitely never going to get there.
Mhm.
And uh, I back to managing expectations with my clients. One of the things I do like to help people understand is, there are times when I spent months promoting a concert that ultimately like 30 people showed up to. And we lost money and months of time and effort went into it. And, not a great night, wasting your time at a show that only 30 people wanted to show up to. But I then compare that to podcasts, and some people are like, man, my podcast is only getting 30 listens a week.
Mhm.
I'm like, you're telling me that people that you didn't have to go out, you didn't have to go rent a venue and a club or set up a whole live event, and you still have people returning every single week, 30 of them? That's a great success where you didn't have to put a ton into it. And if
Mhm.
you can get that up to 50 or 100, you're outpacing so many people that try to do live events, whether it's an entrepreneur event or a meetup or a concert or whatever it might be. You're having more attendance each week than a lot of people that put way more resources into doing something that's live. And so I think that just being able to be consistent and understand, comparatively, if you were doing this, if you were trying to do this same thing in a different format, would you still look at this as a failure?
Mhm.
Or would it be much more costly to do the exact same thing? And if you can kind of put that into perspective, now having only 30 people listen to your podcast week after week is a little bit better than maybe, you
Mhm.
thought about it before.
I also have to really emphasize that. And if there's any entrepreneurs out there that not even the ones that are looking to start a podcast, but the ones that are looking to get on podcasts, you have to realize that, you're going on a medium where there could be subscribers or there could be a number of followers. And, you're not, as you mentioned, you're not paying for all those 17 different things that go up into setting up a live event. There's people, thankfully podcasts have made it very easy for, an audio medium, but you should really take that into consideration as someone that's going on these podcasts about why it should be. It's such a great opportunity because you have people, an audience that's able to listen without those kind of barriers that you have to put up typically from kind of the host or the guest point of view. So,
Well, and even something that's a little more palatable than setting up your own event is just going to a conference and being an exhibitor.
mhm.
I did like one exhibitor table at a conference in Philadelphia, and I also paid like 3,500 to be able to give a talk on doing podcasts. I was all in $5,000.
Mhm.
I had to pay for banners and a table and a tablecloth just for me to then be able to do that talk,
Mhm.
and I didn't get anything out of it. So I would have at least rather come on any podcast and talk to 20 people that might have been more engaged than any of the people that are at that conference, not have to leave home, not have to pay $5,000 all in. Much better trade of time and potential.
For sure. And I appreciate you sharing that example. To switch gears a little bit about here. So technically you're an entrepreneur and I'm sure you have to have a lot of challenges or you face a lot of challenges in kind of doing your work in your life. But from a high level perspective, as an entrepreneur, how do you balance your work life and your personal life?
I think I balance it pretty well because I just follow where my motivations
Mhm.
are at the time. But, there are times I should definitely put my head down a little bit longer and get some more work done. You know, I think even an hour more a day and I could have more, you know, more revenue and more success. But I don't know. Lots of people have problems with being too into their work and not spending enough time on the work-life balance of their family and stuff. Whereas if someone asks me in June last minute if I want to go golfing and I've got 2 calls coming up, I know those calls can be rescheduled.
Yep.
And if one of them can't, I just have to take it while I'm on the golf course. Not that I do that that often, but I try my best to
Live life when
not.
you can.
Yeah, you know, I had a friend that passed away, and you know, very young, and I just remember at his eulogy, someone saying that he had this. He used to say, like, you can always make more money. You know, I don't really. It's easier said than done, but you can always make more money. And I've always thought about that, and like never thought like I'm gonna miss this opportunity because I have to go book a podcast for someone. Like, that podcast will be there for them tomorrow and they're not going to notice the difference.
Right.
So yeah, I think I have a pretty good balance, but I could definitely work a little bit harder at times.
I think that that's a beautiful answer. And I always have these really candid. I love sometimes when I forget what to say on podcasts because, in a way, you know, I have this like structure in my head. And this is really great also for the listener, too, because they could see sometimes, you know, behind the scenes. Well, I guess front house behind the scenes, since, you know, I'll show all this. But basically, you know, it's a really beautiful note on there. And, you know, to get back to the other thing I wanted to ask, it's a tough transition because I think you gave a really beautiful emotional message there in the sense that at the end, you know, we could always have, you know, make more money or do this or do that, but we should try to live life when we can. So I appreciate you sharing that. But on that extended note for me, you know, back to kind of the Outlier audio stuff. What's your vision for the company? Do you see yourself building this self out? Do you hope to get acquired one day? I mean, what's the future hold?
A lot of this service is very personalized and it's based on my efforts. You know, there are definitely people out there that scale up with assistants or VAs, but I believe that the quality of the podcasts they're getting on gets diminished. You know, again, though, if someone's on 50 podcasts, they can't all be top 100. You know, that's just the reality of it. And so, yeah, there are ways I could scale up in time if I have enough people that are coming in on larger campaigns, sure. But I really like working with each person I work with. I like getting to know them. I like them. I like learning from them. And I really appreciate that they put their trust in me. And their money, you know, they put into me, and I'm not at a point where I'm really comfortable passing that off to somebody else. I know that that's a scaling issue for a lot of people. You know, it's something I'll have to work through one day. But yeah, I don't really want to have a staff of 50 people anyway. The max I'd ever really want to have is like a staff of 3 to 5, and those are highly selected people, you know, selected people based on them wanting to do what I do. I don't want someone to just get a job with me. I want them to do what I'm doing and care about it as much as I do. At least the service itself, maybe not the company. I can't ever expect someone else to care about my company more than I do, but at least take the pride in going and getting their client this show. That's the most I can hope for, you know?
On a higher level there, from one of the things that you just said, do you think it's really difficult to scale those relationships?
With the client or the podcast host?
As in, so maybe I'll be a little more specific. Scale those relationships as in, say, for example, if you're working with an entrepreneur and that entrepreneur wants to get on a podcast, right? But say in the future, you know, some big company is like, hey, Spencer, we love Outlier. Like, we'll give you $20 million for it, right? And like you check out, you know, you make this great exit, but you're still involved in the day-to-day operations of your company. But since now you're kind of, you know, an executive within a company, there might be, we'll just say more meat between you and someone that might be dealing with a client directly. So I guess the better question from my perspective is to ask, do you think with more kind of bureaucracy and more, I'll say, heads in between you and the client, the more challenging it is to manage that relationship?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't really want to just become a sales representative for my company. Because I know that I'm selling myself more than anything. I'm not a salesman. You know, I'm oftentimes not even selling my service. I'm selling what it is I think I can do for them. And I would never want to sell somebody and then just pass them off to somebody else. I do know that to scale, I have to be able to let someone else do the job, not as perfect as I would. Not that I do it perfectly, but not as well as I would, and still understand that the client is getting a lot of value out of it and not being so critical on that front. But I do think it's also meeting someone in the middle, and again, someone that is going to take pride in the show that they're getting on, have goals that are not correlated to their salary within the company. I want to get this person on Motley Fool money, and might not work, but at least have always looking for that opportunity. Like, who could I get on Motley Fool money so that I can say I got someone on Motley Fool money? That's what I need in somebody.
Got it. So if it's not you, at least someone that cares as much to, really make sure that they're having that much of an impact on the person they're representing to get on the show that they want.
Yeah. It's hard.
Okay.
It's hard to find.
Yeah, fair enough. Tough life these days. To switch gears a little bit here, you're an entrepreneur, and I saw a LinkedIn post that I thought was really interesting where you said you were running businesses since you were 15. On a bit of a high level here, knowing everything you know now, what advice would you give to your 15-year-old self?
Man, I mean, I would have learned some personal development back then if I could have. Like, I knew I'd started a business, but I wasn't like running a business. It was, I spent money, and at the end of the show, there was more or less money left. And, that was the extent of like me running a business. But learning more about any type of skill set back then would have been really helpful. I mean, when I shifted into music, I definitely learned a lot. But, being more willing to dive into specializing a little bit more would have been helpful. This is really one of the first businesses where I said, like, I'm not going to do other things. I could build out a full marketing agency with this being just the thing that set me apart from other people, because it's cool, is I can also get you on podcast. But I don't want to. I don't care about marketing metrics. I don't care about selling people on Google ads or, other types of SEO optimization and stuff like that. I just care about being able to get them on podcast and get the word out to the world, because it's not just that I'm helping my client. It's that I believe what they are saying is helping the listeners. When I was in music, I planned a music conference for several years, and the whole idea was bringing artists that wanted to take their hobby to the next level, and we put them in a room with industry professionals from all over the country, and it was about trying to provide value to them. And the way I was able to do that was to book the conference. Here, the way I'm able to help the listener is by booking a talented person on a podcast. They have more wisdom to give than I do, but I can help them get that wisdom out there. And so, that's where just being able to learn some of my skill sets earlier on would have been able, I would have been able to do more with that when I was in music. And, maybe be a lot further along than I am now. But, hindsight's 2020. Not many 15-year-olds are learning personal development stuff.
Yeah, for sure. And, I could definitely resonate with you. A lot of it's probably emotional maturity. And I think sometimes when we're older, we just understand things a little bit better. And it still might be hard knowing where we were mentally at 15 to communicate some of that stuff. But I think you did a really good job just kind of talking about specifically the value proposition and really being niche down on that. Because I think a lot of times entrepreneurs try to offer their one service as 17 different things. You're like, look, I don't care about these metrics. I care about you. I care about you getting on the right podcast. And I think that's a beautiful way to look at it. And, really appreciate you sharing a lot of that knowledge. On a parting note here, I think you'll really like this question. So you help a lot of, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of entrepreneurs get on podcasts, get on the right shows, and really put together these value add episodes. On a personal note, do you think you'll ever start a podcast?
Dude, I know I have to. I just haven't yet. My girlfriend that sits next to me, she edits podcasts. Honestly, it's that I've been exposed to so many that my question is, what can I do that's a little bit different? Because that's the only way I'm going to feel motivated by it. I've come upon several ideas that motivate me for a little while, and then they kind of lose the spark. I have one idea I know fits into my business and entrepreneurship that I know I can run off of and if it turns into, maybe I have to shift it down the road or something. But I do. It's happening this year. I just haven't yet.
On the horizon, so we'll have to tune in. But Spencer, really appreciate you taking the time and talking about your past history working in the talent representation industry and what you're doing now and helping entrepreneurs get on podcasts. And on behalf of the podcast community, I have to say thank you and really appreciate you taking the time to share all your wisdom and expertise on the show.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to my conversation with Spencer Carpenter. If you enjoyed the episode, rate the show on Spotify, drop a comment on YouTube, and subscribe.